What if the greatest danger to your soul isn't some dramatic act of rebellion against God? What if the greatest danger is something so ordinary, so comfortable, and so socially accepted that you don't even recognize it as a threat? Right now, as you watch this, there is a battle unfolding around you. Not somewhere far away, not in some ancient story. Right here, in your home, in your habits, in your daily routines, and perhaps most dangerously, in the quiet places of your own heart. And according to Father Chad Ripperger, one of the most recognized voices in spiritual warfare and demonology, that battle is accelerating. The frightening part isn't that evil is becoming more powerful. The frightening part is that millions of people no longer realize they're fighting at all. Before you dismiss that as exaggeration, consider something strange about the age we live in. Human beings have never had more convenience, never had more access to information, never had more technology designed to eliminate discomfort. We can order food without leaving our couch. We can communicate across continents in seconds. We carry more information in our pockets than entire civilizations once possessed. By every material measurement, we should be the happiest generation that has ever lived. But something doesn't add up, because despite all of that comfort, anxiety continues to rise, depression continues to spread, families continue to fracture, meaning continues to disappear. And perhaps most importantly, faith continues to erode. How can a society surrounded by abundance feel so empty? How can people with endless options feel so lost? That contradiction reveals something most people don't want to confront. Comfort is not the same thing as peace. And that's where the story really begins. For centuries, Christians understood a truth that modern culture has almost completely forgotten. The soul grows stronger through struggle. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because difficulty forces a person to confront reality. It strips away illusions. It exposes weaknesses. It reveals what someone actually believes when everything else is taken away. But what happens when an entire civilization becomes obsessed with avoiding discomfort? What happens when every inconvenience can be escaped, every silence can be filled, every painful thought can be distracted away with a screen? According to Father Ripperger, something dangerous happens. The soul becomes soft, and a soft soul is easier to manipulate. Think about it. The devil doesn't need to destroy you in a single moment. He doesn't need some spectacular collapse. He doesn't need headlines. He doesn't need scandal. He only needs drift. A small compromise today, a distraction tomorrow, a neglected prayer the next day, then another and another, until eventually the distance between you and God becomes so great that you no longer remember how you got there. That's what makes this threat so difficult to recognize. Because drift feels harmless. Nobody wakes up one morning intending to abandon their faith. Nobody decides overnight to become spiritually numb. Those transformations happen gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. A person skips prayer because they're tired. Then they skip it because they're busy. Then because they've lost the habit. Then because they no longer see the point. The change is so slow that it feels normal. And that's exactly why it works. The ancient saints understood this better than we do. They warned repeatedly that the greatest enemy wasn't always open rebellion against God. Sometimes it was spiritual indifference. A condition where someone continues performing the external actions of faith while the interior fire slowly dies. Imagine a fireplace that still looks intact from the outside. The structure remains, the bricks remain, everything appears normal. But inside, the fire has gone cold, the warmth is gone, the light is gone, the life is gone. From a distance, nobody notices, but eventually the darkness reveals itself. And Father Ripperger believes that something similar has happened across much of modern society, not through a dramatic collapse, through gradual cooling. The signs are everywhere once you begin looking for them. Families that once prayed together no longer do. Religious traditions passed down for generations quietly disappear. Conversations about eternity are replaced by conversations about entertainment. Questions about salvation are replaced by questions about convenience. Little by little, priorities shift. Little by little, God moves from the center to the edges. And little by little, people adapt to a spiritual darkness they would have recognized immediately just a few generations ago. That may sound harsh, but consider your grandparents for a moment. Whether they were wealthy or poor, educated or uneducated, many possessed something increasingly rare today. A deep awareness that life had a purpose beyond comfort. They understood sacrifice. They understood discipline. They understood that some things mattered more than personal preference. They weren't perfect. But they often possessed a clarity that modern culture struggles to explain because they lived with eternity in mind. Today, many people live as though eternity doesn't exist. And that shift changes everything. When eternity disappears from view, comfort becomes the highest good. Convenience becomes the highest value. Self-expression becomes the highest purpose. But if those become the guiding principles of a society, something eventually breaks. Because human beings were made for more than comfort. And deep down, everyone knows it. That's why people can achieve success and still feel empty. That's why they can accumulate possessions and still feel restless. That's why they can gain followers, status, recognition, and wealth, yet continue searching for something they cannot name. The hunger remains because the soul is looking for something material success was never designed to provide. And here is where Father Ripperger introduces an unsettling observation. What if the greatest spiritual attack of our age isn't obvious evil? What if it's distraction? What if the enemy has discovered that keeping people entertained is far more effective than keeping them terrified? Think about how much noise surrounds modern life. Notifications, advertisements, videos, news cycles, argument, endless streams of information competing for attention every second of every day. Many people cannot sit alone in silence for 5 minutes without reaching for a device. At first, that sounds insignificant. But what happens if silence is where you hear God? What happens if reflection is where conscience speaks? What happens if prayer requires stillness? Then suddenly the inability to be silent becomes much more than a lifestyle preference. It becomes a spiritual vulnerability because a distracted soul is easier to direct. A distracted soul rarely examines itself. A distracted soul rarely asks difficult questions. And a distracted soul can drift for years without realizing how far it has traveled. But the consequences don't stop there, because once distraction becomes normal, another problem emerges. The family begins to weaken. And according to Father Ripperger, that is not an accident. For thousands of years, faith survived primarily through families. Parents taught children. Traditions passed from one generation to the next. Values were reinforced daily inside the home, long before institutions became involved. The family wasn't merely important. It was foundational, which raises a troubling question. If someone wanted to weaken the transmission of faith itself, where would they focus their efforts? Not on buildings, not on programs, not even primarily on institutions. They would target the family. And when you look at modern society, that's exactly where some of the deepest fractures have appeared. Marriage becomes fragile. Commitment becomes negotiable. Parenthood becomes secondary, spared. Belief becomes optional. The roots become weaker. And when roots weaken, people begin searching for substitutes. That search explains many of the cultural movements that seem confusing on the surface. Human beings cannot eliminate their desire for meaning. They cannot erase their need for belonging. They cannot remove their longing for purpose. If they reject one source, they will seek another. Always, the question is whether what they find will actually satisfy them. And increasingly, the answer appears to be no. Because substitute meanings often promise liberation while producing confusion. They promise fulfillment while creating emptiness. They promise freedom while generating dependence. Yet millions continue pursuing them. Why? Because the alternative requires something far more difficult. The alternative requires truth. And truth often demands change. That's where the battle becomes personal, not political, not cultural. Personal, because eventually every discussion about society circles back to a single question. What is happening inside your own soul? Not your neighbors, not your families, not society's, yours. And according to Father Ripperger, that is precisely the question most people spend their lives avoiding, because examining the soul requires honesty. Honesty reveals weaknesses. Weaknesses reveal responsibility. And responsibility demands action. Most people would rather remain distracted, but what happens when distraction runs out? What happens when suffering arrives? What happens when loss comes? What happens when mortality suddenly becomes real? Those are the moments that expose what was truly built beneath the surface. And what Father Ripperger has witnessed over decades of ministry convinced him of something that should concern every person listening. Many people are far less prepared than they think, much less prepared. And the reason why leads directly into the most disturbing part of his warning. Because according to him, the forces shaping this generation are not acting randomly. They are patient. They are strategic. And they have been working far longer than most people realize. What if the cultural battles you see today actually began generations before you were born? What if the ideas transforming society were planted decades earlier? And what if the real target was never simply behavior, but the human soul itself? That is where Father Ripperger's warning becomes impossible to ignore. And to understand it, we need to look at the strategy he believes has been unfolding right in front of us this entire time. The reason Father Chad Ripperger's warning feels different from the countless predictions and alarms people hear every year is because he isn't pointing to a single event. He isn't saying that one political election, one cultural trend, or one shocking headline is going to change everything overnight. His concern is far deeper than that. He believes the real danger is that an entire civilization can slowly lose its ability to recognize truth while convincing itself that nothing is wrong. And history shows that when people lose the ability to recognize reality, collapse rarely begins with explosions. It begins with confusion. Think about how every major decline in history unfolded. Long before empires fell, people stopped believing in the principles that built them. Long before institutions collapsed, trust disappeared. Long before societies broke apart, individuals became disconnected from purpose. The external collapse was simply the visible result of an internal one. And that is what makes our moment so significant. Father Ripperger argues that the crisis we are experiencing is not primarily political, economic, or technological. Those are symptoms. The deeper issue is spiritual. Because when a culture forgets what human beings are for, every other problem becomes impossible to solve. This is why he repeatedly returns to one uncomfortable observation. The enemy's greatest victories are often invisible. People imagine temptation as a dramatic moment, a sudden decision, a catastrophic mistake. But in reality, the most effective temptations are usually the ones that feel reasonable, the compromises that appear harmless, the habits that seem insignificant, the distractions that slowly become addictions. Because once a person is spiritually asleep, they don't need to be pushed. They move in the wrong direction on their own, and nowhere is that more evident than in the next generation. Father Ripperger repeatedly warns that the battle for the future is being fought through the formation of young people. Not because young people are weak, but because they are influential. The beliefs formed during youth often shape entire lifetimes. The values accepted during adolescence become the foundation of future families. The habits developed in those years determine the trajectory of future communities. Which means whoever shapes the minds of the young ultimately shapes the future itself. That realization should force every parent, every teacher, every pastor, and every believer to ask a difficult question. If you removed church attendance from the equation, what is actually forming the next generation? Is it prayer? Is it wisdom? Is it truth? Or is it entertainment, algorithms, social pressure, and endless digital noise? Because something is always teaching, something is always shaping, something is always disciplining. The only question is whether we are paying attention to what it is. Yet, despite the seriousness of these warnings, Father Ripperger refuses to end in despair. In fact, this is where his message takes a dramatic turn, because after describing the darkness, he points to something that many people overlook. Throughout history, some of the greatest saints emerged during the worst crises. Some of the strongest believers lived during the most chaotic times. Some of the most powerful spiritual renewals occurred when decline appeared irreversible. Why? Because God has never depended on favorable circumstances to transform souls. That truth changes everything. Because if the crisis is spiritual, then the solution is spiritual too. And according to Father Ripperger, the solution is not hidden. It has been available all along. It begins with prayer, not occasional prayer, not emergency prayer. Not the kind of prayer people offer when they run out of options. Real prayer, the disciplined decision to meet God consistently, regardless of feelings, regardless of distractions, regardless of circumstances. Because one of the greatest misconceptions about spiritual growth is the belief that motivation comes first. Most people think they need to feel inspired before they begin. But the saints understood the opposite. Discipline comes first. The feelings often come later. The commitment creates the transformation. And this is where the modern person encounters a challenge. We have been trained to seek immediate results. We want quick improvements, instant answers, visible progress. But the interior life doesn't work that way. The strongest trees grow slowly. The deepest roots develop underground where nobody can see them. In the same way, spiritual strength often develops in hidden places, long before it becomes visible in public life. That is why Father Ripperger emphasizes consistency over intensity. 15 minutes of daily prayer may seem insignificant. One confession may seem ordinary. One act of sacrifice may seem small. But over time, those practices reshape a person from the inside out. They restore clarity. They strengthen conscience. They sharpen perception. They reconnect the soul to reality. And reality is exactly what many people have been missing. Because the modern world constantly encourages people to define themselves according to temporary things: career success, popularity, achievement, wealth, recognition. Yet every one of those things eventually fades. Careers end. Trends change. Fame disappears. Money loses its power. The question is what remains when everything temporary is stripped away. Father Ripperger has spent years witnessing people at the end of life, and one lesson appears again and again. At the moment of death, priorities become crystal clear. The arguments that seemed so important suddenly lose significance. The distractions that consumed attention no longer matter. The status symbols that once felt essential become irrelevant. What remains is the soul and its relationship with God. That reality may sound uncomfortable, but it is also profoundly liberating, because it reminds us that every day matters, every choice matters, every act of love matters, every prayer matters, every sacrifice matters, not because human beings earn salvation through effort, but because the direction of a life is determined by thousands of small decisions made over time. The person you become tomorrow is shaped by what you choose today. The future is not created all at once. It is created one decision at a time, and perhaps that is the deepest reason behind Father Ripperger's urgency. He is not trying to frighten people into panic. He is trying to wake them up before they waste the time they still have. Because despite all the warnings, despite all the concerns, despite all the darkness he sees around him, his final message remains one of hope. There is still time. Time to pray. Time to change. Time to return. Time to rebuild. Time to become the person God created you to be. The enemy may be patient, but grace is powerful. The culture may be confused, but truth remains unchanged. The world may grow darker, but darkness has never defeated light. And that is the choice standing before every person watching this right now. Not whether the world has problems. Not whether the culture is struggling. Not whether society is changing. But whether you will respond. Whether you will continue drifting or begin moving intentionally. Whether you will remain distracted or become awake. Whether you will spend your life chasing temporary things or orient your life toward what lasts forever. Because one day every excuse will disappear. One day every distraction will end. One day every person will stand face to face with the reality they spent their entire life moving toward. And when that day arrives, the question will not be, what happened in the world around you? The question will be, what happened within you? What did you do with the time you were given? What did you love? What did you pursue? What did you become? Father Chad Ripperger's warning ultimately comes down to that single question. Not a prediction, not a conspiracy, not a headline. A question, and perhaps the reason it resonates so deeply is because every person already knows the answer matters. There may not be as much time as we think, but there is still time, and what happens next is up to us.